We're going to have a look at a style of writing which became known internationally under the name of English. The round hand is a style of calligraphy. I'm showing here a font made in the 1960s, but based on the work of Charles Snell. And this text sets out the reform that he conducted. Of course, the style goes back to the 16th century in Italy, the new handwriting introduced by Giovan Francesco Cresci in the 1560s. And the later versions of it became known through the medium of engraving on a copper plate, which allowed the fine engraving tool to make very thin and then swelling lines. If we take one letter and strip away the other parts of it, you can see that, for example, here we have a line that swells and diminishes, and that's the basis of the new form of writing. And of course, we shall see it also in typography. Here is the style that Snell was one of the people, the writing masters, who introduced it into usage in Britain. Clearly, it wasn't always as simple as Snell's model. And here is the title page of another writing master's book, engraved by a certain George Bickham. And Bickham, with a writing book called The Universal Penman, was one of the rather dominant writing teachers of the early 18th century. A few of the images from that Universal Penman will show the kind of impact that he hoped to make. How to get riches. And as he says in his introduction, those who promote this writing have helped writing to become the glory of Great Britain. That is, in promoting the maritime empire on which much 18th century wealth was based. So there he is signing off the Universal Penman. And here is one of the commercial documents, an invoice for the shipment of wine, which shows the complexity of detail that had to be packed into a document that stood for a very large amount of money. The ownership of the wine, but divided into various areas of responsibility. And finally, a document to be carried by someone on his travels, giving him the right to draw for money on a banker in Paris through the agency of the fictitious Abel Cash. So the beginning of portable documents that would become banknotes, traveller's checks, and finally other forms of carrying money. John Baskerville of Birmingham is known for his printing, but he began as a writing master. This advertisement shows that he was also the cutter of gravestones in the finely grained medium of slate, but he cut in any of the hands, that is, any of the styles of handwriting, and giving his trade as writing master. He prospered in Birmingham, becoming a manufacturer of various kinds of goods for which Birmingham was becoming famous as a boom town, and finally had enough money to set up a printing office. Here to start with is his own writing as he signs a letter in 1773. Here is the nearest he got to saying what encouraged him to get into printing. This is in his edition of Milton's Paradise Lost. In fact, I ought to show how he goes on. There's the whole page, and he makes a reference to his contemporary in making type, Mr. Caslon. And there he says, in his great variety, I intend not to follow him, just making Roman and italic. If in these he's left room for improvement, well, he tried to do too much, which of course he did. He made Arabic and Hebrew and various other scripts. Here's a specimen of Baskerville's types, the types that were made by him, for him. He seems not to have cut his own punches. But here it is, probably in the year of his first book in 1757. And it's a specimen I was able to get for the St. Bride Library. It shows quite nicely the calligraphic quality of his Roman with these rounded curves, no hard edges to it. And of course, if we move to italic, the calligraphic element comes in even more visibly. It made a very striking difference to the look of the page. The Virgil of 1757 was the book that helped him make his mark, which needed doing because the British printing trade was overwhelmingly concentrated on London for all kinds of reasons, not least political ones. So the idea that you could make a fine book in Birmingham was a challenge to contemporary opinion. Anyway, here is a part of the page of that Virgil, allowing the rather fine titling capitals to spread across the page. And if we look at particularly the capital Q, we see that the swelling line of calligraphy is a feature of Baskerville's types. As I said, he's not known to have actually cut his punches, but they were certainly derived from the calligraphic material that he must have offered to a punch cutter. This is going to look at the so-called fine printing, which followed on the model of Baskerville and other printers of the 18th century, who were able to draw on the mercantile or financial prosperity created during that period. This example of a type made in Bristol, a very prosperous port, of course, in the 18th century, is done for a man called Fry, who was a Quaker and who made something of a fortune dealing in chocolate as an innocent drink compared with the alcohols of the period. And I suppose he got into making type as a relatively moral trade to follow. Quakers, of course, were limited in what they could do. They couldn't go to a university in England because they wouldn't sign up to the Church of England. They couldn't go into the army. That was against their moral principles. All that was left for them to do was to be traders. And their high standards of morality enable them to get, on the whole, rather rich. Joseph Fry wisely transferred his type-making operation to London, where the market was for type. The chocolate making stayed in Bristol until the beginning of the 20th century, when it was taken over by the rival Quaker chocolate factories of the Cadburys. Here is a smaller size of the Roman type that he marketed in London, quite explicitly based on the work of John Baskerville. If you look at the Q at the end of the line of capitals, you'll see how closely he followed the Baskerville model. The new style, the Baskerville style, in a sense, spread in Britain. Here you have in Scotland the Wilson type foundry, which again is following the Baskerville model. Rather more rugged, robust than the Fry style, and none the worse for that, I think. And with a partner, he even produced a kind of bold version of the Baskerville style. Again, a little bit rough, but with great vigour and stylishness. In London, a new punch cutter was Richard Austin, who is certainly one of the major characters in this late 18th century world. That's simply his trade card, showing that he did all kinds of other tools for making letters. But his most conspicuous early work was for an entrepreneur called John Bell, who was able to exploit the slackening of copyright laws to produce all kinds of books that sold well, sometimes because they were cheap. But in the case of Bell, it was often using new type, using new wove paper, which gave a smoother finish and showed up the detail of the type. This type is certainly influenced by French models. Yes, you've got the calligraphic capital Q, but there are certain other features here. The serifs of the lowercase are absolutely flat, and the Didots, and indeed the Romain du Roi come into the picture here. The Baskerville type had created a certain effect in the continent of Europe, and in fact Baskerville's materials were bought up by a certain Beaumarchais, curious character who made his money, frankly, in gun running and espionage and other trades. He bought Baskerville's type and he set up a printing works or a printing office just over the edge of France, beyond Strasbourg, in what was technically Germany, because Voltaire was an author who was not legally printable in France. And so here is rather rough-looking printing on a rather rough paper done for Beaumarchais. But it attracted attention. Here, for example, is Baskerville type used to print the works of the Italian poet Alfieri, who clearly wanted the name of Baskerville to be put at the foot of his title page. Cail was the location of the Beaumarchais printing office, just the other side of the Rhine from Strasbourg. And Baskerville was, in a sense, given the final accolade by the revolutionary regime in France, who used Baskerville type for the national newspaper, the Gazette Nationale. And as you can see, that is an image from the back page of the paper, avec les caractères de Baskerville, this new style of type. In England, the Baskerville style was adopted for printing which would rival some of the new works printed by Bodoni and the Didots, which we shall look at. William Bulmer was set up by some merchants in the city of London in order to print at what was called the Shakespeare printing office. That's the foot of that title page. And a credit to the making of the type was included. William Martin was a relative of Baskerville's manager of his type foundry. The type itself, we're in the 1790s now, is curiously old-fashioned. 40 years after Baskerville began, here is what is really a new take on Baskerville's own type. It is bolder, it has more contrast between thick and thin, but if anything, it's even more old-fashioned. Certainly more so than the types of the Didots, which it's challenging. And it even keeps the long S in that fourth line, we cannot miss him. That had been dropped, the long S, by the French, but here it is in a double S. The new style is also seen in commercial type founding. Here is type made for the foundry started by William Caslon, but by about 1800 the old Caslon types could no longer be sold, and so very daringly the owner of the foundry got a contemporary punch cutter, Drury, to make a type in the new style. Here's a detail of a book printed in this new Caslon type in 1804, and it's a curiosity because it includes, in a rather confused way, two different forms of lowercase t. The one in the top line here is essentially based on the types of Didot, which came from the Roman du Roi of the beginning of the 18th century. And this printer was far from certain which to use. And the second line, you have a traditional pointed T side by side with the new style. And then in the third line, you've actually got the pointed T's. So there we are. There was confusion. On the whole, in England, they went back to that pointed form. Here's an example of the new British style, printed in Edinburgh in a Scottish type. It was stereotyped, which is quite a challenge because that means making cast plates, but they've managed to keep the delicacy of the modelling of the type rather well. And I'm showing this partly because you can also see the kerning of the italic F, which was a great challenge to type founders. But this is the new English style of the 19th century. And I'm going to conclude with a type made by William Miller, which became known for rather complicated reasons as Scotch Roman. And here you can indeed see the pointed T to which the British type founders and punch cutters remained faithful